As I yearn for deep understanding, cosmos consciousness, ultimate meaning or purpose, if any, I've come to see the arts as a channel of exploration. Sure, I've enjoyed the arts, especially music, but I never imagined the arts as windows on hidden realities. The idea that the arts in all its forms, music, painting, sculpture, dance, literature, could provide a fresh way to seek deep understanding surprised me. How did I come to view art as a kind of revelation? It was through a long-term project of the Templeton Religion Trust, Art Seeking Understanding. I was invited to participate, and although the project is just commencing, 2 workshops are held, I'm taken to speculate about possible end results. Art Seeking Understanding? What could it mean? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my journey to find out. Originally, the Art Seeking Understanding project had a more academic name. It was called Aesthetic Cognitivism, which focuses on the cognitive value of art in addition to its aesthetic value. Aesthetic cognitivism subjects art to a scientific way of thinking and discovery, and appreciates art at its best as a kind of understanding. So, the question, what kind of understanding could the arts convey beyond appreciation and enjoyment? The first workshop was held in Nassau, Bahamas. I was there searching for meaning in that kind of understanding the arts convey. I began with the project director of Art Seeking Understanding, an expert on natural theology and the arts, Christopher Brewer. Chris, what are the aspirations of aesthetic cognitivism? If you look to the development, its meaning, the implications of it, what do you aspire to?
To begin, I would say that the aspirations of aesthetic cognitivism have to be primarily descriptive. We may think of progress in terms of identifying various types of knowledge or various types of understanding, or even describing certain phenomena, sort of in the near term. In the long term, I think that the questions will emerge that need answering. I'm not quite sure what those are yet.
Well, that's good. I mean, that makes it exciting. Right. But you think there are such questions out there?
Yes. So one thing that I find fascinating is a number of anecdotal stories where people are standing before a piece of art and suddenly it transforms them. Why is it that there are people who before a painting suddenly shift their complete life and worldview? What sorts of knowledge claims or understanding is occurring in that sort of an instance?
And those can be addressed, and people might say they're emotional experiences, and emotional experience have that reaction, but you say that there might be something more than that.
There could be, and I think that it would have to be examined to see exactly what's happening there.
Can you differentiate between knowledge and understanding from a theological context?
I'm not sure that I have a particularly theological perspective, except that I sort of have this category of wisdom, in the back of my mind, applied sorts of knowledge that would be prevalent in biblical literature, say. But I do think that, in one sense, understanding could be conceived of as coming after knowledge, where it helps us make sense of things or make connections between things we already know. There's another sense in which it might be a precursor to those sorts of things, where it's not yet a proposition, but it's sort of the inklings of something.
So it makes sense that as you build up knowledge, the cumulative effect is that one would get understanding from that. But your claim is that you can even do it in reverse, that you need understanding to be a framework to appreciate the specific propositions of knowledge.
So it might be that understanding could be a precursor as well as sort of coming after a result of knowledge. Thinking of the precursor, though, it may be something on the way to knowledge, something that is the beginning of a proposition.
As you look ultimately for the implications of aesthetic cognitivism, how could theology be a component of that?
Perhaps in the field of natural theology, to clarify how the arts might play a role with reference to the knowledge of God, one, or perhaps even something more general, like restoring a sort of porosity between the immanent world and the transcendent other. William Desmond, the Irish Catholic philosopher, talks about a postulatory finitism, that we just sort of begin with the finite. Art has a tendency to poke holes in that sort of thing, where perhaps standing before a painting, you may be disposed towards a finite frame of reference, and suddenly that frame isn't sufficient to explain the experience that you're having before the painting. That has theological implications.
Chris offers art with high spiritual ambition. Art, to deny that only the physical world is the real world. Art, to affirm that the real world is more than the physical world. I'd be all for downgrading the physical world from being all of reality to being only part of reality. But I'd be hard-pressed on art to do the trick. Irrespective of my personal wishes to jump from art to non-physical reality, I'd need evidence and argument, serious progress. Looking to the future, what might constitute progress in understanding art? Attending the workshop in Nassau is the cognitive scientist, Justin Barrett.
You know, I would hope that 20 years from now, not only would we have more scholars from lots of different disciplines working in the area, but that we wouldn't even be approaching it the same way. The arts will remain a heuristic category, but we're going to realize that some of the forms of human expression we think of as art actually have as much cognitively in common as some areas that we consider philosophy or we consider rhetoric or gardening. We're going to see parallels that we just haven't seen before. That's going to be progress.
Some people think that's anti-progress because it would sort of be a reductionism of the art to particularities that all of which will be true, scientifically determined. It will eliminate the mystery or the awe of appreciating the gestalt, the totality of it. Is that a danger?
Yeah, it's not a danger I'm afraid of because, look, this notion of the arts, we don't even see it all over the world, right, for one thing. It's a relatively new, sort of modern-ish kind of concept as it is, and it keeps changing whatever it means anyway. That's just to say, it's a folk category, maybe it's a scholarly category on certain levels of analysis, but if we're talking about how do people think, how are they motivated, what causes them to engage in certain forms of expression like this, how do those spread, our existing categories just don't apply. And to bemoan the loss of those, it seems to me that's trying to hang on to the past.
If that occurs, and if we have that larger understanding, what will it mean for us? Some people think that we'll have a better sense of realities beyond the physical. Is that even in the realm of possibility?
Well, I'm sure it's in the realm of possibility. I guess I'm optimistic about these sorts of things. It also strikes me that we'd have the potential of being able to hone more specifically on some of these areas of the arts that really do prompt us to see connections that we haven't seen before. It may be that we can tap some human potential that we haven't tapped before because we've been sort of carrying around.
Justin sees progress in discerning new, fine-grained categories that describe and discern art, novel perspectives on how art happens and on what art means. Could this include possible realities beyond the physical? Leaping over logic? What's the evidence? What's the argument? A more manageable step is to distinguish understanding from knowledge. Is art up to the challenge? I ask an artist and art critic with religious interests, Jonathan Anderson.
I think one of the things that aesthetic cognitivism does is it shifts the question from knowledge, what do we know, to understanding, what do we understand? And understanding has huge implications for the arts. A more difficult question, maybe a more narrow question, is what do we know? What sources of knowledge or kinds of knowledge do the arts produce? And that tends to close conversation. Whereas what kind of understandings, what sorts of overall relationships, relatedness between things, ideas, perceptions, what kind of understanding is produced, that's a very interesting question for the arts.
Well, let's start with the knowledge question.
Often because the arts don't produce things that hold up as knowledge in other discourses, in the sciences, in philosophy. It's a much more difficult question to answer. What does a still life painting, what kinds of knowledge does it produce? Whereas, what sorts of relationships are explored in a still life painting that helps us understand the ways that people make sense of life, make sense of themselves? I think art is a relational medium. Humans think about life in terms of relationships, and we use spatial models, visual models that we encounter in everyday life, and we use those models to make sense of really big abstract ideas. So we talk about economics in terms of rising and falling bubbles and collapsing, and we use very spatial metaphors. Theology, philosophy, those have they're full of very spatial visual language. And when you come to the arts, what the arts do is expressly experiment with the meanings of spatial relationships, visual relationships, temporal relationships. The arts become a kind of testing ground for experimenting with the ways that we put things together, and that provides a kind of grammar or a set of models that I think we use in a lot of other disciplines. And aesthetic cognitivism is interesting for the ways that it puts much more emphasis on forms of understanding.
So what are the implications for that in terms of the nature of reality?
There would maybe need to be particular instances where we see how this or that experimentation with relations segues into sort of larger ideas. We'll take the visual arts to begin with. The ways that they speak, the grammar that they use, has to do with the relationships between densities and expansions, with delicate qualities versus very sturdy qualities, centers versus perimeters, and so on, intensities and dullnesses. And it thinks in those terms, and those are often the same terms that we use to think about other disciplines with and other aspects of life.
Jonathan's claim is that since relationships are central to understanding, and art can model or reflect relationships, plus communicate them in visceral ways, art has a unique capacity to access understanding, especially in non-verbal ways. How can art move from understanding to non-physical realities, to be blunt about it, to religion? What's the target here? At the workshop, I meet a British philosopher of religion, also a philosopher of the arts, David Brown. David, in exploring aesthetic cognitivism, what's the end result?
I mean, so far as my hope for religion is concerned, then it would be that you discover a better understanding of how religion works and why change is possible in religion. So far as the arts more generally are concerned, I think there is a problem of how they're evaluated. What's art about? They might say it's the creation of beauty. But much modern art isn't concerned with beauty. Francis Bacon's paintings, I mean, I don't think I would call them in any sense beautiful, but they're still great art. So you've got a different kind of question. And I think aesthetic cognitivism might actually help in saying, what is it they're trying to do?
So it enlarges our understanding of art. But what more can I learn?
Well, you can look at specific works of art and perhaps understand better how they're working.
Okay.
So is their impact produced by, say, the symbolism, or is it produced by certain types of imagination, or is it produced by emotional reaction, or maybe it's even performative? You do something and as an artwork, and that has an effect. I mean, if you think of a very traditional example in the last respect of an army, why do armies march to music? It's partly to get the right atmosphere to them, so they're actually changed in the process of marching. To be better fighters, they realize that there is a form of knowledge going on there.
Art as challenging to discern. Art as diverse modalities, symbolism, imagination, emotion. Art as changemaker. Can these elements also reflect religion? Given I'm in an art-religion context, what's an extreme case of intense symbolism, imagination, emotion? I speak with an expert on the Book of Revelation in the New Testament, Director of the Graduate Program in Theology and the Arts at St. Andrews University, Judith Wolfe.
At its basic, aesthetic cognitivism is the claim that the arts are not just candy for the soul, and it's not just a means of propagandizing or communicating something that we already know. It's the claim that there is something in the arts that allows us to perceive in ways that we otherwise couldn't what is out there. I think one of the ways in which aesthetic cognitivism can help us to understand both theology and eschatology better, and in turn be illuminated by them, is that it focuses on the role of the imagination in everyday perception. It's the part of the mind, sort of quasi-cognitive faculty, that allows us to get from the individual phenomena that we perceive to an interpreted whole. If that's true, if to see at all, to perceive at all, is always to imagine a framework for the things that we see, which is not given with the things, but is to some extent supplied by us, well, then the imagination is inalienable to what we understand as perception. And religious perception is not necessarily all that different from what it is to perceive at all, because religious belief is a perception of the ordinary as having a kind of depth or being organized within a kind of framework that ultimately is bounded by God. Eschatology is ultimately the belief that we are not in a world that's already complete, but rather in a world that is bounded by, whether you want to call it the last judgment or heaven and hell, the last things in any case. But it's also very risky, of course, because the imagination doesn't guarantee its own accuracy. But I think this nexus of things, that perception is always constructive to some extent, that religious faith is a particular construction of the ordinary world, and that eschatology is a framing of the ordinary world within particular parameters, all works together and is something that's perfectly explored by what we hope to do in aesthetic cognitivism.
You talked about the bidirectionality between the arts and eschatology. On the one hand, the arts can help you discern eschatology better. On the other direction, the existence of eschatology can reflect on what the arts are and can discern more in the arts, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. The Book of Revelation is bizarre. It has bizarre images. I think the core images of eschatology are not necessarily those of the city that's strange, dimensional, and so forth. It's more the basic images of resurrection, of reunion, of judgment, and so forth. So it's those images that I'm more interested in. And I think that art gives us images of perfection. It gives us images of a world that has order, that has significance, that has beauty in a way that the ordinary world doesn't. And therefore, I think by doing so, it awakens our desire for a world that really is like that. It awakens our desire for the last things. And that desire, I think, is a fundamental part of what it is to live eschatologically, because that is the assertion that things are not yet as they're meant to be. And on the other hand, of course, eschatology can help us to illuminate that aspect of the arts, that the arts are not self-contained, that artworks don't figure something that's necessarily already present in the world, nor do they figure something that's necessarily just the subjective experience or expectation of the artist, but that they might, in some instances, gesture towards something ahead of us.
To Judith, art enables perception of the otherwise imperceptible, exemplified here by eschatology, the theological vision of last things. Art with bizarre images, vivifying eschatology, eschatology with ultimate impact, intensifying art. This bi-directional flow of explanation between the concept of art and the content of art helps frame meaning for the Art-Seeking Understanding project. But from last things back to current things, where does the Art-Seeking Understanding project stand now? Following the second workshop in Grand Rapids, what happens from here? I asked the project's originator, Vice President of the Templeton Religion Trust, philosopher Christopher Stewart. Chris, how has your understanding of aesthetic cognitivism been shaped or changed in any way?
Well, I think it's become more nuanced. I think when we started just defining the idea internal to Templeton, so we defined the idea very broadly. So in terms of the kind of broad concepts that Sir John has about spiritual information, about the ways that people come to an understanding and make discoveries about spiritual reality. But that's pretty broad. And what you don't know is whether or not you'll be able to ask the right kinds of questions that scientists can help us with, but which are also defined by people like philosophers and theologians who can ask the questions in ways that are going to be meaningful and relevant.
Did you make some progress in that? What has been your enriched understanding of what aesthetic cognitivism is?
Yeah, so for example, if you think about the sort of phenomenology of religious experience, it could be feelings that people have of desire or arousal, or a sense of the numinous, or of the holy or the sacred, the sense that you're in the presence of something that goes beyond what you see in front of you that's not you, and things like that. So you break down the sort of phenomenology of religious experience a little bit more.
And the arts can do that.
The arts can do that, and then you sort of say, well, how does that happen in the context of the arts, right? That becomes the next question. So how can the arts stimulate desire and arousal? In what context does anything, including, say, a work of art, point to something other than itself? I mean, you can see if we do this right, you have all kinds of implications for the ways that people experience the arts, depending on what your goals are. So there are, in the context of aesthetic experience, for certain kinds of aspects of perceptual experience, like cross-modal perception. How do multiple sense modalities interact? So that's going on in the neurobiology, physiologically, and so on. But then there's also, for us, in terms of Templeton's interest, there's a sense of encounter with something mind-independent, right? That's the objectivity, something that everybody has equal access to. Something that's not you, something that exerts a constraint on your thinking that is not a construction of your imagination. So how does that work? How does a reality like that constrain the way you think about it? How do the arts shape human cognition?
What do you see as the major categories that would be targets for requests for proposals or for research programs?
A lot of this kind of conceptual work has been done, but we're thinking, well, here's the repertoire of kinds of experiences that we're interested in, things that philosophers and artists and theologians talk about. But also, even before we get seriously into the kind of experimental work, where you're actually dealing with testable hypotheses, you're handing it over to people that are more detailed to dig a little deeper into this phenomenological structure of whatever the types of experience you talked about. But also, now we need to sort of document these types of experiences, right? So this is a more descriptive phase. The people that do the kind of social scientists largely, but art historians as well, who can document, here's how we see it historically, here's how we see it globally distributed, and then we begin to see patterns. So it's not just gawking at the world, right? We have, it's like observation defined as a perception in light of a question, right?
That could be tested experimentally.
Experimentally, right.
And so it's really three phases.
It's really three phases.
The clarification of the concepts, the gathering of data by social science anthropologists to then target individual research programs with testable hypotheses.
Right, and then it's only when you've done that that you can have both solid ground, how you approach the arts and the way you value them as a society.
Do you think you can accomplish all this in less than half a century?
No, I don't think so. So we're talking about something that's going to outlast us, so by far. But fortunately at Templeton, we can take the long view.
At its heart, art-seeking understanding is a search for meaning. It takes iconic expressions of human consciousness, the arts, and subjects them to analysis and reflection. Philosophy, defining art terms. Sociology, collecting art data. Psychology, running art experiments, testing art hypotheses. Neuroscience, examining the brain when creating or appreciating art. Theology, exploring the nexus between art and religion and enjoying some speculations. Questions include, why can the arts be life-changing? Will research reveal new categories for describing art? Can art distinguish between knowledge and understanding? Can art facilitate change, even in religion? How does art enable perception of the otherwise imperceptible? Still, this is only the beginning of explorations. As the Art Seeking Understanding project develops over the next years, we'll be there, tracking research, following arguments, searching for meaning, trying to get closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.